So Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is probably one of the most well-known works in Middle English literature. It has been the subject of several translations, both in poetry and in revised prose form, including a relatively famous translation by Lord of the Rings author and Oxford professor J.R.R. Tolkien. And to this day, it serves as foundational reading in numerous intro-level English classes, including some of the ones here at Gordon. To briefly recap the story and to introduce it to those who may not be familiar with the tale, the poem centers on Sir Gawain, a knight of King Arthur's court who accepts a challenge from the Green Knight to cut off his head as long as the blow can be returned 1 year from that day. Gawain accepts his challenge, and over the course of the poem, he sets out to find the dwelling place of the Green Knight. At one point of his quest, over the Christmas season, he becomes the guest at Hout Desert, the court of Lord and Lady Bertilac. During his time here, the lady makes several attempts to seduce Gawain. He resists her advances, but in the end, he accepts a gift from her in the form of a green girdle, or belt, which she claims will protect him from the blows of the Green Knight when he finds him. Eventually, Lord Bertilac is revealed as the Green Knight, and Gawain returns to Camelot unharmed, but reprimanded for his temporary cowardice in accepting the lady's gift. Certain critics have suggested that despite Gawain's lapse in judgment and return to Camelot under a somewhat shameful situation, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is ultimately an optimistic poem that celebrates the ideal values of true knighthood through the ultimate triumph of its hero. However, I would argue that the poem does not present the concept of knighthood as a unified ideal. In this time with you today, I would like to briefly sketch the poet's presentation of 3 conflicting definitions of knighthood. The ideal knight as defined either by sexual passion, chastity, or certain habits of courtly life. The scope of the poet's treatment of this subject is huge. Almost every aspect of the poem deals with the question of how to define knighthood. However, I will focus in this paper on 2 prominent ways in which this question is dealt with. First, through the character of Lady Bertilac, and second, the court at Camelot. Both of these represent romantic idealizations of knighthood that are incompatible with Gawain's own ideas. Through Gawain's interaction with these 2 objects, the poet presents opposing views of what constitutes true knighthood and demonstrates their incompatibility with one another. My work with this text has been in the original Middle English. However, for the purposes of this presentation and for your reference, I'm going to provide on screen both the text that I quote in the original language and in translation. The most prominent oppositions of courtesy in knighthood arise in the temptation scenes that take place at Sir Bertilac's court. Here, the reader is presented with Lady Bertilac's opinion that true knighthood is closely linked with sexual passion, which comes in direct conflict with Gawain's ideas of chastity and honoring hospitality. There is no direct dialectical debate between the 2 about these ideals. Rather, the poet uses the complex language of courtly love to demonstrate the opposition. One might say that the dualisms that I'm presenting are the ultimate forms of miscommunication in a relationship. In her encounters with Sir Gawain, much of the lady's language seems to be merely playful banter. When Lady Bertilac first enters Gawain's room, for example, she declares, "Now you are tan estate, but truest may shapa, I shall bind you now in your bed, that be ye traced." Even in this initial encounter, which the lady puts forward as a mere joke, there are several sexual connotations that arise when used in the context of Gawain's bedroom. The use of the word tan here can mean both captured and discovered. On the surface, Lady Bertilac is simply making a joke about how easy it would be to capture Gawain, who was off guard in his sleep. However, in another sense, he is now captured by the will of the lady in his bedroom. She has certain expectations for him, in essence, to have sexual relations, that he must now try and evade. And the fact that they are also having such discourse in secret also plays in the definition of tan as being discovered. If the 2 are discovered in such a compromising situation, it will be the worst for both of them. Secondly, the lady here states that she shall keep Gawain captive, but true us me shapa, us being defined as a compromise or truce of some kind. On the one hand, such a statement would mean that she was waiting for him to make some kind of truce with her. On the other hand, the word us can also mean for 2 people to have sexual relations. Thus, even when the lady's banter seems innocent enough, and may well be at this point, it still contains suggestions of innuendo. Further on in the conversation, the lady continues with such double talk, yet the potency of her words is much more obvious. She tells Gawain, "You are welcome to my courts, your awan one to wala. We behoves of fiends of force, your servant be, and shalla." Most critics have remarked on the apparent shock of these words. Is the lady really being so overt as to offer her body to Gawain so soon, especially following their innocent banter? There's a general consensus that the lady is merely suggesting, through the use of wordplay, course playing on courts and one on dwelling, not delight or pleasure, that Gawain is more than welcome into her house. Lady Bertilac can use such diction without Gawain even assuming that to actually sleep with him is her true intent, and in fact, for him to assume as much would show immediate disrespect for the lady. Mills point out in his article on this poem that such usage of language was quite common in medieval conceptions of love talk. Using language that contains innuendo or double meaning can, quote, allow the speaker to go off record, not to commit himself to one attributable intention, and thereby to avoid being held accountable for any offense or unpleasantness. The fact remains, however, that the underlying sexual meanings are still there, and that as time goes by, Gawain becomes aware, along with the reader, that the flexibility and unassuming nature of love talk is indeed hiding something on the part of the lady. Gawain uses the same kind of language that Lady Bertilac uses, yet he chooses to ignore the sexual undertones. After Lady Bertilac's initial approach, Gawain responds by suggesting that he should bow onto this bed and busk him better, and that by doing so, he should cover the more comfort to carp the lady with. Gawain manages to play along with the lady, but also attempts to set some boundaries in their interaction without being forward by suggesting that he should get dressed and clothe himself before continuing their conversation any farther. What the poet introduces here then is a difference in the inner perceptions of each of the characters. Both are using the same kind of language, but with different interpretations and different ends. Gawain realizes that he will have to struggle to maintain his ideal of chastity and obligation to his host, Sir Bertilac, and at the same time not offend the lady by bluntly refusing her advances. And because of the dualism of love language, the intentions of either party cannot be mentioned without risking offense or embarrassment on the part of the other. Such conflict is best encapsulated in the second meeting between Lady Bertilac and Gawain. Here the lady is much more explicit in stating her ideals of what makes a true knight. She argues that of all the chivalry to chose, the chief thing of those is the lack of love, the leisure of arms. Later in her speech, she expresses her surprise that Gawain is knight come lookest kid of his elder, yet heard she never of your head held no words that ever longed to love, lassa ne mora. Lady Bertilac here states her belief that true knighthood is equated not only to valor in arms, but also in the pursuit of love. In doing so, she questions Gawain's honor as a true knight, as she has never heard him make any mention of love or seen any demonstration of love from him, most precisely to her. Here, it is the lady's purpose to shift the meaning of courtesy from its purely social and virtuous associations so that it becomes a quality dependent on adulterous and dishonorable action, while also hinting that Gawain's reputation depends on such action. In other words, she makes ideal knighthood defined by the sexual actions of the knight, and is suggesting that because Gawain is not sleeping with her, he is not really a true knight. Once again, Gawain subtly deflects the lady's insinuations in two ways. First, he compliments her by suggesting that she knows much more of love than he does, and he deems it futile to talk about love to you that, I wot well does more slighted that art, by the half or 100 of such as I am other ever shall. Furthermore, Gawain's continuation of double language implies that the lady has more knowledge of love because she is a married woman, and at the same time suggests that Gawain is not experienced in the art of sexual relations. Bringing up her marriage also reminds Lady Bertilac of her and Gawain's different obligations to her husband, an instant counter to the lady's previous statement that Gawain should teach her love while my lord, i.e. her husband, is from home. Every dialogue between Gawain and Lady Bertilac bears a similar tone. The lady of the house continues to question Gawain's character because he will not make love to her, while Gawain must continue to courteously refuse her. There are some contrasting views on what exactly motivates Gawain. After all, it is suggested later in the poem that he does desire in some way, as joy warms his heart when she comes to him for the last time. In her romance of exchange, critic Stephanie Trigg notes that Gawain's prior contracts, one with the Green Knight and the other as the guest of Sir Bertilac, who ironically turns out to be the Green Knight, both play part in his motivation to refuse the lady. At first, it is his preoccupation with the Green Knight which makes him disinterested in the lady. He's simply too worried about his quest to worry about pursuing any relationship with her. But later, the obligation to Sir Bertilac to be a loyal guest and therefore not cheat on him with his wife presents a double bind which prevents him from completely fulfilling his duty. The question is, how can he honor the lady and her advances without dishonoring her husband? And this is the bind that Gawain is in. For him, the answer would be to be courteous to the lady, but what the lady intends as a come on, Gawain deliberately misreads as politeness, pure and simple, and answers her as such. Lady Bertilac tries to insist that Gawain cannot be the true Gawain that the courts knew of as a courteous and knowledgeable of love, but Gawain must do his best to refute this without disagreeing directly. Gawain and Lady Bertilac's perceptions of courtesy are completely different and unable to work in harmony. To turn to our other primary mode of analysis, Arthur's court at Camelot does not merely demonstrate a perception of knighthood. Here, the poet also infers the ultimate demise of such a perception. Arthur's court is presented as a place of relative immaturity and lightheartedness, especially considering the events that take place in Camelot as opposed to what occurs at Houtdesert, the residence of Lord and Lady Bertilac. First, the leaders of the respective courts, Arthur and Lord Bertilac, are placed as sharp contrasts to one another in terms of character. Arthur is described as somewhat childered. His life liked him light, he loved the lassa, other to longa lie or longa sit. Meanwhile, Lord Bertilac is depicted as a holga hafel for the nuns and of high elde, bella faces the fire, and free of his speech. Arthur's immaturity and youthfulness is emphasized in his physical appearance, whereas the hardiness and nobility of Sir Bertilac in the fire in his speech is the focal point of his nature. The fact that the courts are under such different leadership perhaps suggests the relative immaturity of Camelot's perception of Gawain's quest, as opposed to the gravity of the situation that it's given to Gawain himself, and that it receives while he is at Houtdesert. The actions of those under these leaders also support this idea. When the reader first encounters the knights at Camelot at the beginning of the poem, they are taking part in jousting tournaments and forfeits as part of the Christmas and New Year season. It is into this context that the Green Knight introduces his challenge as a Christmas Gawain, or game. One wonders, is this perhaps the only context in which the knights, who seem relatively youthful and immature, could understand such a proposal? Would it have been accepted under any more serious context? It is initially unclear whether the court will receive it as a game or give it some more significance, but by the end of the poem it seems that they indeed had given it little thought beyond a holiday entertainment. It is true that after the first encounter with the knight, when Gawain accepts a challenge, and then later the knight rides off into the night, Arthur, the Hinde king, at a heart had wonder, and he regards the event with some measure of awe. However, he later compares the beheading to the other festivities, suggesting that it is in the style of Christmas season to have such liking of interludes to laugh and to sing among these kinde carols of knights and ladies. This comment is intended to calm a frightened Guinevere. However, to the reader, such words of comfort seem to come off as a kind of flippancy. Arthur's first show of courtesy, that is, to comfort his wife, is to label the sinister challenge as a game. And by the end of the poem, the wonder that has, however briefly, bewildered Arthur and the rest of the court has completely vanished. Upon Gawain's return after his quest, the reader sees that the king comforts a knight, and all the court awes, laughing louder thereat. One critic argues that, quote, the laughter of the knights, as that of the Green Knight earlier on, does not express derision of an ideal, but sympathy and comfort. However, I would disagree, as context seems to suggest otherwise, that the laughter of those at Arthur's court is demonstrative of an immature audience whose idea of knighthood is that of surface entertainment and shallowness. In comparison to Houtdesert, where the majority of courtiers engage in religious activity at Christmas time, and then in rigorous hunting expeditions, Camelot seems a feeble place. Trigg comments that, quote, by the time Gawain is ready to leave Houtdesert, its daily and nightly routines have been presented in so much detail in an early form of bourgeois realism that in comparison Arthur's court, which we experience at the beginning and the end of the poem, seems hopelessly stilted and artificial, a mythical, static past where people never grow old. It is also not insignificant that the poem bookends the poem in direct correlation with our scenes of Camelot, within references to Troy, a once majestic city that was burdened and rent to Brondus and Ascus by the toll that the tremors of treason there wrought. If such destruction can happen to a kingdom that was perceived as impregnable, i.e. Troy, it is only to follow that Camelot, which is closely associated with Troy, with its light views on Gawain's grave and serious journey, will come to the same end of destruction, and perhaps all the more quicker. Could it be that the traitor from within, as mentioned in these lines with reference to Troy, could also apply to Camelot? And is it possible that this traitor will ultimately be their innocent and playful ideologies? The poet's presentation of Camelot would certainly suggest so. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a poem riddled with comment. Although it first seems to take traditional romance as its pattern, the social commentary on the idea of romance is prominent. It was written in a time when the social order of knighthood and chivalry was becoming less autonomous in England, and also at a time when simple stories were usually more than they seemed. The Gawain poet presents an interesting perspective on the idea of courtesy and courtly behavior. He depicts three different modes of belief as regards chivalry: the chastity of Gawain, the love-longing of Lady Bertilac, and the light-hearted attitude of King Arthur and his court at Camelot. The poem presents these three modes of belief in conflict and shows them to be incompatible. One cannot be a true knight, it seems, that satisfies all the criteria and expectations presented by the various characters. And so it seems that the poet is very likely making a comment on the death of old ideals. As the social world around the poet changes, he writes this into Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It is a tale signaling the death of the old world of chivalry and the beginning of a